Let me talk to you like you're sitting right beside me right now. Not online. Not through a screen. Just you and me. Because what I'm about to say is going to challenge something you've probably believed for a long time. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men don't want to hear. When you finally give up on an avoidant, that's often when they panic the most. Not when you're chasing. Not when you're explaining yourself. Not when you're trying to fix things. It's when you stop. And no, this isn't about manipulation. It's about human psychology. Most people assume avoidants don't care. That they're cold. That once they pull away, they've emotionally checked out forever. That belief sounds logical, but it's wrong. Deeply wrong. And believing it keeps a lot of men stuck, either waiting too long or walking away without understanding what really just happened. Avoidant attachment isn't the absence of emotion. It's the fear of it. It's someone who learned early that closeness feels unsafe, unpredictable, or overwhelming. So they create distance, not because they're strong, but because distance feels like control. Here's where it gets controversial. When you keep pursuing an avoidant, you're predictable. You're safe. You're controllable. They may feel pressured, but they're not panicking. In fact, your effort reassures them that they still matter without requiring them to show up fully. But the moment you genuinely stop, no long messages, no emotional speeches, no just checking in, something shifts internally. Their system no longer feels in control. The connection they assumed would always be there suddenly isn't. That's when panic begins. Not loud panic. Not dramatic panic. Avoidant panic is quiet, internal, confusing. It shows up as overthinking, restlessness, sudden curiosity, and an uncomfortable question they hate asking themselves. Did I misjudge this? This video isn't about blaming avoidance. And it's definitely not about turning you into someone who plays games. It's about helping you understand what actually happens after you walk away, so you stop misreading silence as indifference and start seeing it for what it often is: delayed emotional impact. As men, we're taught to either chase harder or shut down completely. Rarely are we taught how emotional distance really works on people who fear closeness. So let's break it down. Calmly, clearly, and without the nonsense. Let me say this plainly, and this might sting a little. The first thing that breaks inside an avoidant when you truly give up isn't their heart. It's their ego. And before you dismiss that as shallow, listen carefully. When you've been consistently available, patient, understanding, when you've been the one explaining, forgiving, waiting, you unknowingly become a fixed point in their world. You're predictable. You're stable. You're there. Not because they feel deeply safe with intimacy, but because your presence feels guaranteed. So when you stop, when your energy changes without an announcement, when there's no dramatic goodbye, no emotional outburst, no final speech, that's when the ego takes the hit. Avoidants are used to being the ones who pull back. They're comfortable controlling distance. That's their emotional safety zone. But when you decide you're done, and you don't chase or seek validation, the dynamic flips. And that flip is jarring. Here's the controversial truth most men don't hear. They didn't think you'd actually leave. Not because they thought you were weak, but because your consistency trained them to believe your patience had no limit. And when something you assumed was permanent suddenly disappears, the mind doesn't go straight to emotion. It goes to identity. Questions start forming internally. Why didn't they fight this time? Did I lose control of the situation? Was I wrong about how invested they were? This isn't love yet. This is shock. The ego doesn't like unanswered questions. It doesn't like losing leverage. It doesn't like realizing someone else made a decision without needing approval. And for avoidants, who rely heavily on emotional distance to feel safe, this loss of perceived control creates internal tension they're not good at processing. So what do? They replay moments. They mentally review conversations. They start noticing your absence in small, unexpected ways. Not because they suddenly became emotionally open, but because their internal balance was disrupted. Here's where men often misread the situation. You assume that if they cared, they'd immediately reach out. But avoidant panic doesn't look like pursuit. It looks like internal scrambling. They don't know how to respond without exposing vulnerability, so they pause. They think. They rationalize. And that pause? That's the ego trying to regain footing. This is also why some avoidants suddenly become distant and observant at the same time. They may not text, but they notice if you stop viewing stories. They notice if you disappear socially. They notice if your energy is no longer oriented toward them. Why? Because your absence removes a mirror they use to confirm their own value. Here's the part men need to hear clearly. This stage isn't about winning them back. It's about breaking an illusion, yours and theirs. Yours because you realize your constant effort was holding the dynamic together. Theirs because they realize you weren't as controllable as they assumed. The ego shock is uncomfortable, confusing, and destabilizing. And once it hits, there's no going back to the old dynamic. Something has shifted. And from here, the panic doesn't disappear, it deepens. Here's where things get uncomfortable, and this is the part most avoidants will deny even to themselves. When you truly give up, the chase doesn't stop. It just moves inward. Avoidants rarely chase externally. They don't blow up your phone. They don't suddenly confess emotions. That would require vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what their nervous system is trained to avoid. So instead, the pursuit becomes mental. Quiet, private, invisible. They start checking, not your messages, but the situation. They start thinking, not about reconciliation but about meaning. They start wondering, not how do I get them back, but what changed? This is panic in a controlled form. For a long time, your attention worked like emotional insurance. Even when things were distant, they could rely on the idea that you were still there. When that certainty disappears, the mind looks for substitutes. Memory becomes one of them. They replay conversations. They revisit moments they dismissed. They mentally zoom in on times you were patient, calm, consistent. And here's the controversial part. Your absence forces emotional presence inside them. Not the kind they're comfortable expressing, but the kind they can't fully shut off. You may notice strange shifts around this time. Energy changes. Random reappearances. Subtle signals that feel confusing because they don't come with clarity or accountability. That's because what's happening isn't intentional pursuit, it's internal regulation. They're trying to settle something unsettled. This stage often creates mixed signals because the avoidant is split between two instincts. The need to restore emotional safety by re-establishing control. The fear of getting close enough to feel exposed. So instead of direct action, they hover psychologically. They think about reaching out. They imagine scenarios. They consider what they could say, then decide it's safer to say nothing. Men often misunderstand this phase and assume, if they cared, they'd act. But avoidants don't act under emotional pressure the way secure people do. Their system first tries to think its way out of discomfort, and thinking feels safer than feeling. Here's where your role matters more than you realize. If you break your silence during this stage, if you step back into reassurance, explanation, or emotional availability, you unintentionally end their internal chase. You stabilize them again. You return them to comfort without requiring growth. And that's the trap. This phase isn't about proving your value. It's about letting the absence speak. Not aggressively. Not manipulatively. Just honestly. The internal chase is exhausting for avoidants because it removes their favorite coping strategy: distance. They can't distance themselves from their own thoughts. And for the first time, they're forced to sit with uncertainty, something they've always tried to avoid. Here's the key takeaway for men. Silence isn't empty. It's informative. When you stop reaching, explaining, or waiting, the avoidant doesn't relax, they reflect. And reflection, for someone who avoids emotional depth, feels like pressure. This stage doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it's movement. And once the mind starts chasing, emotion isn't far behind. This is the stage that feels the most familiar to you, because you've probably lived it from the other side. When an avoidant realizes you're truly gone, emotion shows up without instructions. No script. No plan. No clear label. Just a low-level pressure they can't name and don't like. And that's unsettling for them. Avoidants rely heavily on internal explanations to stay regulated. They tell themselves stories like, "This isn't serious. I don't need anyone. This connection wasn't that deep." Those narratives help them stay calm. But when you leave quietly, without drama, without begging, without emotional chaos, those explanations stop working. Now the feelings don't match the story. They may feel restless, distracted, more aware of quiet moments, more aware of what's missing. And here's the key thing to understand. They don't immediately recognize this as loss. Loss requires emotional acknowledgement, and that's something they've trained themselves to delay. So instead, confusion takes over. They might think about you at unexpected times. They might feel irritation that doesn't have a clear source. They might notice a strange dip in motivation or focus. None of this feels dramatic, but all of it feels off. This is where the internal dialogue gets louder. Why am I thinking about this now? I thought I was fine with distance. Why does this feel different? What makes this stage powerful is that there's no one to regulate them anymore. You're not there to soften the edges, to explain your intentions, or to emotionally translate the situation for them. They're alone with it. And for avoidance, being alone with unprocessed emotion is uncomfortable. Not because they're weak, but because they never learned how to stay present with it. Here's the relatable part for you as a man. You know that feeling when you expected something to hurt less than it does? When you told yourself you were prepared, but the reality doesn't line up. That gap between expectation and experience, that's where confusion lives. This is also the stage where avoidance may try to intellectualize what's happening. They analyze. They compare. They downplay. They remind themselves of reasons the connection wouldn't have worked anyway. But logic doesn't fully quiet emotion. It only delays it. And the absence of examples, arguments, or emotional scenes from you makes it worse. There's nothing concrete to push against. No conflict to blame. No moment to point to and say, that's where it ended. Just distance. For men watching this, here's the grounding truth. You don't need to be loud to be felt. Your calm exit creates emotional ambiguity, and ambiguity forces reflection. Not instantly, not cleanly, but deeply. This stage is uncomfortable because it exposes something avoidants try hard not to face. That connection mattered more than they admitted, even to themselves. And once confusion sets in, the next stage isn't clarity. It's defense. This is where things get uncomfortable, not just for the avoidant, but for you as a man watching this. After confusion settles in, panic doesn't disappear. It mutates. It turns into delayed regret. Not the clean kind. Not the kind that says, I should have handled that better. This regret is quieter, defensive, and often wrapped in excuses. Avoidants begin to feel the loss, but instead of moving toward accountability, they protect themselves by shifting meaning. They may think, it wasn't the right timing. They were too emotional anyway. I needed space. This was inevitable. Here's the truth most people won't say out loud. Regret shows up before responsibility, but pride decides what happens next. And this is where men often sabotage themselves. Some men wait here. They read into subtle signals. They interpret indirect energy as progress. They assume regret means change is coming. It doesn't. Not automatically. Regret without accountability is just emotional discomfort. And avoidants are very good at tolerating discomfort if it means avoiding vulnerability. Now here's the part that might sting, but it's said with respect. A lot of men unintentionally train avoidance to stay avoidant. By over-explaining. By accepting half-answers. By rewarding minimal effort with full access. By mistaking emotional distance for emotional depth. So when delayed regret shows up, some men rush in to make it easier. They offer reassurance. They reopen communication. They soften the consequences. And in doing that, they remove the very pressure that could have led to growth. This isn't strength. This is fear disguised as patience. Here's the calm wake-up call. You don't help someone grow by rescuing them from their own reflection. Delayed regret is powerful only if it's allowed to sit long enough to turn into insight. And insight only forms when someone has to face the reality of their choices without being shielded from them. From the avoidant side, this stage feels tense. They feel the absence more clearly now. They notice patterns. They compare what they had to what they feel now. But instead of reaching forward, they often look sideways. For reasons, for flaws, for explanations that don't require them to change. That's blame shifting. And blame shifting isn't malicious. It's protective. It keeps them from asking the hardest question of all. What did my avoidance cost me? For you, as a man, this is the moment to recalibrate your self-respect. Not through anger. Not through silence as punishment. But through consistency in your boundaries. If someone regrets losing access to you, that regret should come with clarity, effort, and accountability, not ambiguity. You don't need to confront. You don't need to prove a point. You just need to stop confusing potential with reality. Because here's the reality. Regret that doesn't lead to action isn't regret. It's discomfort. And your job isn't to relieve it. This stage exists to reveal something, to them and to you. Whether it leads to growth or emotional shutdown depends on what happens next. And that brings us to the final fork in the road. This is the stage that decides everything. By now, the avoidant has felt the shock, the internal chase, the confusion, and the delayed regret. The question is no longer what happened. It's what they do with it. And there are only two paths forward. The first path is growth. The second is emotional shutdown. There is no middle ground. Growth begins quietly. It doesn't start with grand gestures or emotional speeches. It starts with an uncomfortable realization. I can't keep doing this the same way. For the avoidant, this means recognizing patterns instead of defending them. It means seeing that distance didn't protect them. It cost them something real. It means understanding that control through withdrawal isn't strength. It's avoidance dressed up as independence. If growth happens, it shows up as clear communication, not vague signals. Ownership, not explanations. Effort that doesn't need to be chased. But here's the controversial truth most men miss. Growth is rare, and it's not triggered by waiting. It's triggered by consequence. The avoidant has to feel that access to you isn't automatic anymore. That you didn't leave to teach a lesson. You left because something wasn't working. And unless that reality stays intact, growth never takes root. The second path is emotional shutdown. This is where many avoidants go, not because they don't care, but because caring feels too destabilizing. Instead of leaning into reflection, they double down on emotional distance. They tell themselves they're better off this way. They bury the discomfort under distraction, productivity, or superficial connections. From the outside, it can look like they've moved on quickly. Inside, it's unresolved. But unresolved feels safer to them than vulnerability. Now here's what men need to hear, calmly and clearly. Your role ends here. You cannot choose this fork for someone else. You cannot love someone into emotional courage. And you cannot negotiate someone out of avoidance. What you can do is decide which version of yourself you're willing to be. The man who waits indefinitely, hoping awareness turns into action. Or the man who respects the growth process enough not to interrupt it. Here's the grounding truth. If someone chooses shutdown, your presence won't save them, but your absence might teach them something. And even if it doesn't, it still protects you. This final stage isn't about winning. It's about alignment. Because real connection doesn't require chasing someone through their fear. It requires two people willing to stay present, even when it's uncomfortable. And if they can't meet you there, the most powerful thing you can do isn't convince them. It's move forward without resentment. That's not giving up. That's choosing self-respect. Here's the controversial truth I want to leave you with, and I want you to really sit with this. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave someone alone long enough to feel the weight of losing you. Not to punish them. Not to manipulate them. But because growth does not happen in comfort, and avoidance survives on comfort. If someone only values you when you're available, patient, and emotionally convenient, they don't value you. They value access. And the moment you remove that access, whatever rises to the surface tells you everything you need to know. Some avoidance will grow. Some will shut down. And some will convince themselves they never cared, because that story hurts less than accountability. But here's what matters most. Your life does not pause while someone figures themselves out. As men, we're often taught to endure quietly, to wait, to be understanding at the cost of our own emotional clarity. That's not strength. Strength is knowing when effort turns into self-abandonment. If any part of this video felt uncomfortably familiar, I want you to comment your experience below. What stage did you recognize? What part hit the hardest? I read the comments, and when I can, I reach out. Not as an expert above you, but as someone who understands the weight of these dynamics. You're not crazy for walking away. You're not weak for feeling it. And you're not wrong for wanting something healthier. Sometimes giving up isn't quitting. It's choosing yourself, for the first time.